Hey everyone, Kevin here with Victory 4x4. In this video we're going to be installing our engine, transmission, and transfer case skid system on our 2006 Toyota 4Runner. Now this 4Runner is equipped with the V8, however this skid installation will transfer over to the V6 models as well as the Lexus GX470. So as we get started, you guys can obviously see that our vehicle is no longer equipped with a full factory front bumper, therefore it's missing any splash guard or skid that may have been in place here between the front bumper and this lower cross member. If you guys have something there, it's most likely either going to be kind of a thin stamped steel or a molded plastic that can be removed with either a 10mm socket or a 12mm socket. So with that being said, we'll now come back here under the differential and get this factory skid removed. This one's held in with 4 bolts. You've got 2 in these locations here in the front, along with 2 in the back, kind of on the back corners. So as you can kind of tell by the condition of the skid versus the frame, we've kind of had this off already, both to do our R&D and a little bit of frame cleanup on this vehicle. So with that being said, I've got this held in place with just 2 bolts up here so we can show you just the bolt locations and how this comes down. We'll start out with the back 2, or in my case the one on this passenger side. These use a 12mm socket, and once removed, there's kind of a hook right over in this area that goes up into the factory cross member and just sort of loosely holds the back side of the skid up. And then while holding the front of the skid, you can come up here and remove the 2 mounting bolts at the front edge. Now this one was already broke off when we got this vehicle, so I'm just going over here to the driver's side, again supporting the skid, and we can get this removed. Then you should be able to sort of pivot this down and slide that tab out of its hole in the frame. Now with that out of the way, we can move on to assembly for our front skid. And I do just want to point out that if you guys happen to encounter a broken bolt like we did in one of our locations, we're not reusing those factory skid mounting points, so that's not a big deal. Just make sure that there's not part of the bolt protruding down where it's going to interfere with anything, and if there is, just grind it flush to the frame, maybe touch it up with some paint and move on. I will begin up here by this lower radiator cross member. What you're doing here is taking the 2 5/16 by 2 inch long bolts along with washers, and we're going to be installing these with the serrated flange nuts up on the top side of the cross member. And with these, you're basically just going to thread the bolt in until it is pretty much flush with the back side of the nut. So one is over here on the driver's side, the other is going to go over here closer to the passenger side, where we'll just be doing kind of the exact same thing. As far as identifying these hole locations, it's going to be pretty easy with a tape measure to just transfer the information from the skid over to the vehicle. We'll also give you a couple measurements here that should help you out. Basically just measuring from this line bracket here, you'll come over, it's about 3 3/8 to 3 1/2 from the center of this bolt head over to the center of this bolt. And then going over to the passenger side, we've got about 10 1/4 to 10 3/8 there. There is some play in these holes, so your measurements might vary just a little bit, but that should get you to the correct hole locations. Next, we'll move back to this rear cross member at the back of these lower control arms, as well as the rear diff mount right here. This is where we'll be installing these 2 nut plates. Basically with these, you're gonna slide them up behind the lower control arm and into the cross member where they'll line up with these lower mounting holes down here. Now when installing these, you just want to make sure that the pre-installed nuts wind up top so that the plate can sit nice and flat to the inside of the cross member. And you'll basically have to kind of stand it vertical, and then once up there, push this bottom side in toward the center of the vehicle and let that slide down. Once the plate is in the cross member, you'll still need to get it lined up. 1 plate with these 2 outer holes, as well as 1 plate over here on the other side. For that, you can either reach through the larger holes here in the bottom or up over the top through the corresponding holes. And then you're just kind of walking this over and getting it roughly aligned with the center of these holes. With both plates aligned, we can move on and grab our front skid and start hanging it on those front 2 bolts. For this step, I grabbed our hydraulic transmission jack If you're doing this on the ground, kind of in your driveway or something, you can do the same thing with a floor jack, or just grab a friend to help you slide this up into place. So on this front mounting flange, you're going to have the two narrower slots here. Those are what you're going to be basically hanging on the two bolts that we installed earlier, and then these two wider cutouts are going to just be clearance holes for the two line mounting brackets. So when you have the skid in the correct position, you'll see that the bolts will be pretty much at the front edge of these slots, and then we'll just leave these loose until the rear mounting hardware is in place. However, when we do go to tighten these up, you'll just want to make sure that the hard line mounting brackets are sitting fully into the appropriate cutouts in the front edge of the skid and not creating any interference that would prevent this from sitting flat to the cross member. Then at the back of the skid, we'll be installing two of these 1/2 inch by 1.5 inch long button head bolts. You'll simply slide them in through the bottom of the skid, and these are threading into the nut plates that we slid into this cross member earlier on. You may have to reach over the top and down through one of those upper holes just to kind of temporarily hold or manipulate that nut plate into the correct place. Now how you move forward from here is really going to depend on what all you're installing at this time. So those of you just installing a front engine skid, you'll find two more of those same button head bolts, this time with large washers. These will thread into the outer nuts here in those nut plates just to hold them in place and prevent any rotation in that plate before tightening up these 4 rear bolts. Now since we are installing our full skid system at this time, I'll pull this bolt back out and essentially discard the washer, and I'm just going to be reusing the actual bolt to mount the front of our transmission skid. And then it'll just be kind of the exact opposite. If you're only installing the mid transmission skid, you'll use the two outer holes here for your main mounting hardware, as that's where the skid's going to line up and locate, and then the bolts with washers here in the center locations. Now that we have all our engine skid hardware kind of loosely in place, I can drop my jack out of the way and we'll get our access doors installed. I'll start with the differential access door so that I can still use the oil drain door, just kind of to manipulate hardware into place. This will bolt in with a 5/16 by 3/4 long button head, which kind of holding the door through the center here. You can hold the bolt with your thumb. It'll also have a serrated flange nut that will slide up over the top. You can also reach over the side of the skid to manipulate these as well. And we'll work that up into place and begin starting some of this mounting hardware. And then same thing here at the front. You can push the bolt through the access door, get it lined up, and now reach through that oil drain hole in order to start the nut. Once you have all 6 bolts in place, you'll grab a 3/16 hex and tighten things up. Then the front access door, we'll use the same 5/16 hardware and install in a very similar manner, just using one bolt front and rear. Since this uses the same 5/16 hardware, it'll use the same 3/16 hex, and I do think it's important to point out that these can be installed before the skid ever goes on the vehicle or at this time. Again, for those of you only installing this front skid at this time, you can now tighten things up. So for the rear 1/2 inch button heads, you'll need a 5/16 hex driver. Up here, you'll want a 1/2 inch, preferably ratcheting wrench, so that you can reach in through the side and get to those bolts. In order to aid in alignment of our mid-transmission skid, we're going to leave this hardware loose for now until we kind of have everything in place, and then we'll come back and tighten everything up. Before this trans skid can go on, you will have to remove the 2 frame braces that you see here and on the driver's side. For that, you'll need a 12mm socket, and then again, if your vehicle looks anything like the bottom of this one did, you may want to rely on some penetrating lubricant as well as some heat if that can safely be applied in those locations to get these removed without damaging or breaking the bolts. Now our first one did break off up here. I expect this one to maybe do the same. That's not really a big problem out here as we're not going to be mounting in this location. Once you get to the back side of this brace, this is where you need to be a little more careful, and you will need to salvage this bolt location because we are going to bolt in kind of a nut plate, mounting plate to those using that factory thread. So I've got a small breaker bar on this one. We soaked it in penetrating lube earlier. I was able to salvage the one side, and then it looks like this one broke, so I'm gonna have a little more work to do here, but we should be able to get this down now. So every one of these is gonna be a little bit different. In our case, we did wind up breaking 3 out of the 4 bolts, but we were able to extract all of them and save the threads in the factory holes. So the way we did that and what worked for us was there was enough of this bolt left over hanging down that I was able to simply kind of clean up the big rust chunks around it, heat this up and grab a hold of it with some vice grips and kind of work it back and forth and safely spin these out of here. An alternative, which we didn't have to go to this extreme, but you could possibly wind up drilling these and using a screw extractor, or absolute worst case scenario, there is access to the top side of these through a hole in this cross member where you could potentially drop a nut down and get that lined up and start it with a bolt that you may have to source if you wind up in that scenario. So hopefully you were able to salvage those threads, and now you're ready to get your mid skid installed. Now here I have the mid skid in the correct orientation. So you'll see these welded standoffs. Those are going to only be on one end. That goes toward the rear of the vehicle. And once you've identified that, you can grab the bolt-in nut plate that will lay on top of those and line up using these smaller slots here. That's going to be to bolt in the transfer case skid that we're installing along with this. So for those of you that are only installing a mid skid, this won't be necessary. Now the only critical thing about this is making sure that the nuts are up, as they will kind of slide into slots in the frame, and then you may just have to kind of slide it up here one time and check that you have it in the correct orientation, as the spacing on these nuts are just a little bit different from side to side. Once you've identified all that, we can begin jacking this up in place and lining up the front cutout with the back of our engine skid. So here at the front of the skid, you're just going to need 2 more of your 1/2 inch by 1.5 inch long button heads. You'll need to make sure that both skids kind of nest nicely together here, and then you can thread these into those nut strips in the frame. Here at the back of the skid, you'll use the 4 flanged hex head M8 bolts in your bolt pack. Those are going to install through the slots here, through the nut plate, and into the frame. Then, being that we are continuing on and installing our transfer case skid, we'll leave that hardware loose at this time. At this point, we can move into the transfer case skid installation. Now, before the skid cross member as well as the skid can go into place, we've got a little bit of work to do up here on the driver's side frame rail. We're going to start off with this brake line mounting bracket and specifically getting its mounting bolt removed. You'll need a 12mm socket to get this bolt removed, as well as potentially some penetrating lubricant. Be careful using heat up here, as you are so close to these brake lines. Now, with that bolt removed, you should be able to manipulate these brake lines enough to slide our skid cross member in behind this mounting bracket during installation. And I will point out that these mounting holes are mirrored over on the passenger side of the frame, but specifically this threaded hole location may need an 8mm tap ran through it just to chase those threads out so that you can get our hardware installed. Also, before this cross member goes in place, you will need to install 2 of these nut tabs, 1 per side. So here you're looking at the driver's side, which is going to slide through this rectangular hole. You're going to put the nut end in first and kind of push that slightly forward to manipulate this through the hole and into the frame. You may also need to lightly push on this brake line bracket as you slip this in, and then it's basically going to come down and forward to line up with this hole here in the bottom of the frame rail. And then you can simply repeat that process on the other side with the passenger side nut tab. Next, you can grab your skid mounting cross member and get it into place. You can identify the front by a forward facing arrow here in the center of the cross member, and then it should simply slide up in the frame and begin lining up with those holes we previously talked about. Now, out here on the sides, you'll begin by installing an 8mm flanged hex head through the rear hole in this mount. Then on the driver's side, this will pass through that factory brake line bracket as well as the cross member, securing it to the frame. Now in the bottom of the cross member, you'll need to find the 1/2 inch by 1 inch long button heads, which will pass through the cross member, through the frame, and thread into the nut tabs that you installed earlier. Now once you have all your mounting hardware in place, both driver and passenger side, you can grab a 5/16 hex and tighten up these lower button heads and a 13mm socket for the side mounting bolts. Now with the cross member in, you can begin raising the skid into place. It's going to secure using 6 of these 1/2 inch by 1.5 inch long button head bolts. The front 4 are going to thread into that nut plate that we installed earlier along with the transmission skid, and then the rear 2, you will have 2 of these 1/2 inch serrated flanged nuts that you're going to have to place on top of that cross member for the rear 2 to thread in. So then it's just a matter of raising this up and getting everything lined up, and then working to install your hardware. So now at this point, you should have all your hardware in for the full skid system, and you can work your way through tightening things up. Now for all of your 1/2 inch button head hardware, you'll need a 5/16 hex, and for all of the 8mm hex head bolts, you'll need a 13mm socket. Then lastly, here at the front, we can reach through the side with a 1/2 inch, preferably ratcheting wrench, and tighten up the 2 front mounting bolts. So with all that hardware tight, your installation is complete. Now if you guys have any questions at all about this skid install or anything else we offer here at Victory 4x4, you can always reach out to us. You can send us an email at info@victory4x4.com or just give us a call at 269-459-8447.